Good evening, I'm Heather Carlisle, and I'm delighted to be here broadcasting live. And as always, my motto is know yourself, treasure life, and love others. Tonight we're talking about no blame allowed, avoiding control and judgment. So recently I've been noticing that underneath so many of the challenges that people bring to me is judgment. Somebody judged them, they're judging somebody else, and you've heard me previously talk about pointing the finger of blame and the idea that constructive criticism is never constructive because criticism is never constructive. So we have these old patterns of blaming, of finding fault. And of course, when we're kids, we tend to do that if our parents aren't clever. So there are people now who know us how to be very clever parents and to be ahead of our kids all the time. After all, they're just kids, right? So many of these things we've learned in childhood, and so much is let me turn off my phone. Something just came in. Hi, Tookie. So much we've learned in our childhood, but so much I'm watching wherever I go. Kind of like there's a flag that pops up to me that says, judgment. That was a criticism. That was a guilting. That was a placing blame. That was an insult. That was a defense mechanism. That was manipulative. That was mean. That was irresponsible. That was unaccountable. All of those things and more. So one of the things underneath those judgments, of course, and defense mechanisms is we've been injured. And we're looking to find fault, looking to blame, looking maybe to get revenge. None of those are a good idea. Because what we want to do is figure out how to solve the problem. Come here, Tookie. When I start podcasting, she just wants to be here with me and talk to you guys too. Do you want to come up here? Okay, you can come up here. Come on. She did this last time. Now she's purring. At any rate, no blame allowed. Notice it. Notice when you blame somebody. Notice what it feels like when somebody blames you. Notice how negative it is and how it places power somewhere else. So the whole thing, no matter which way you look at it, is negative. It doesn't help anything, it doesn't solve any problems, and it just makes you feel more frustrated or more angry or more blaming and resentful, and it makes the other person feel defensive and wanting to defend themselves, and then of course there's a conflict. So I've been doing my very best to spot it wherever it is, and to refuse it. An element of blame comes from way back with the terrible twos. Because this connects with how we've been parented or led or disciplined or taught with somebody using power and control, where they want control and they're going to do it by overpowering us. And then we get into a power struggle. And if you've ever been in a power struggle with somebody in your house, it's horrible. Because people are equally valuable, and there's nobody needs to be more powerful than another. There's no need for competition. And so then when it's a power struggle, you want to bow out of it. You want to refuse to get to loggerheads with somebody. Now, how you get out of that, that's a whole nother deal, right? And please remember, if you have any comment or any question tonight, don't hesitate to type it to me, and I will see it over there in the corner. So tell me if you're having troubles with a judgment, being judged, blaming somebody else, or being blamed. Oftentimes, that terrible two stuff, we're exerting our sense of self. We need to know ourselves. We need to know that we have power. We have control over what we want and who we want to be. And of course, that means developing a skill set. Goodness sake, if you try to shame a child or use power and control, punishment or reward over a child, then the whole thing is manipulative. It's not straightforward. It's not honest. It's not collaborative. And it's not respectful to either you or the child. Now, they're going to be, as you know, most of you know, being parents, little ones are going to be out of control. They don't know what they're doing yet. They don't know how to handle themselves. And it's for us. I love that idea of they have to plan it, they have to do it, and we won't let them fail. So we guide them. We steer them. We use cleverness. We use fun. We use pictures and stories and color and play to move them in the direction of what's going to work. Now, I understand that that's a whole lot to ask of people. It means if we want to parent and not squash someone's self-esteem or not instill in them the drive to compete and to need to have power and struggle, then that means a whole lot of creativity, and you really need to know what you're doing. So I have something wonderful for you tonight, and this is advanced work. And if you want to really master this, there are several places where I would recommend you go. And of course, parenting classes, the good ones, the really, really good ones. So this is the Cadillac. The Cadillac version is my favorite developmental psychologist. This is the website of Dr. Gordon Neufeld. It's theneufeldinstitute.org. And notice that you can choose all these languages. It's a place where you can go and learn. Of course, there are many teachers who are qualified to teach this. And Dr. Neufeld is a Canadian. So upcoming online courses, other highlighted events. And so there are resources for parents and caregivers, educators, and helping professionals. So there are courses recommended. So if we look at courses recommended for parents, the one that I'm thinking about tonight, because of this is No Blame Allowed, Avoiding Control and Judgment. And that means avoiding counter will, a child's will against us, which is, it's stop. So if we go down here, there's Making Sense of Aggression. That's a good one. But here, Making Sense of Counter Will. This is a miraculous course as far as I'm concerned. And Dr. Neufeld's dissertation was on counter will. It had been ignored for decades, and he brought it up, and he's written with great detail and effectiveness about it. So there's a brief synopsis, the suitability, the objectives, the course outline. This institute is elegant, professional, complete, with depth and artfulness. And if you ever want to encounter Dr. Neufeld, just go to YouTube. He has dozens of hours that you can watch free and get a sense of how warm and brilliant he is. Of course, one of the most important books that I have in my library is this one. Hold on to your kids. The subtitle is They Need You More Than Peers. So this is Dr. Neufeld's book, along with the psychiatrist, Dr. Gabor Mate, who is also one of my great heroes. But there's an entire chapter in here about counterwill, why children become disobedient, instinctive resistance to being forced. Okay, being forced, which is a power struggle. And so blame, when we use blame, we're usually going to point the finger and try to make the other person do what we want them to do. And the easy thing, the old-fashioned thing, when people really didn't have strategies, was to force it. And to force it with either reward, bribery, or punishment, which is abuse. And as you can tell, I'm not a fan of either one of those things. I think it's coercive and it's not very intelligent. And in essence, it's teaching our children and our young ones that we don't know any better. So I want us to know better. I want us to be very clever and very fun and very interesting to our children. And if you don't know how to be that way with your kids or with your friends or your spouse or your family or your fellow workers or your employees, look, study. There are so many of us out here today who know it well, teach it, and makes you very clever, very fun, and very interesting. So, no blame allowed. Pointing the finger of blame is insulting, and it says that we're not willing to take our part of accountability. Now, that's avoiding control and punishment, avoiding judgment. And I would do that at all costs if possible. Now, of course, there's a caveat. If you have been abused or traumatized, or if people are mean, or if they persist in blaming and refuse to take responsibility, or just flat out don't understand how to take responsibility without continuing to accost you with judgment or blaming or criticisms, that's not going to work. And I do not recommend that you receive that, take it to heart, and try to adapt to it. I recommend that you figure out how to work around this. And this is one of the things that happens sometimes in a marriage, where one person just refuses to take accountability and continues to humiliate and blame and guilt and shame the other person. In my mind, if that doesn't improve, that's a deal breaker. You can't be abused like that and stay healthy. And the other person who delivers that kind of poison and that kind of meanness, that's not good for them either. So if you can save that relationship, find a counselor, find somebody like me, and go talk about it. And talk about it intelligently, without anger, without resentment, without trying to point the finger of blame. To say, I want to take responsibility for my part in this, but I can't take responsibility for the whole thing. This is a relationship. It may not be even Steven. Each person is different, and each person has things that they do well and things that they don't do well. But what I really want is no judgment, which means each one of us taking accountability, which means then we are in control of something rather than trying to control somebody else. And that we can improve, change, fix, grow, be curious, investigate. That's a creative place, and it's an interesting place. So I'm curious if any of you listening have any questions. And it's a delight. Every once in a while I'll be out and about and people will say, I listened to you. And that makes my day. But do chime in. It's always interesting when you do that. So, avoiding control and judgment. If we avoid control, that means that we're going to have to look at why we want to control and what it is that's underneath our need to control. So there's a little story that I sometimes tell. There are certain anxiety types where they're almost compulsive, and some are compulsive in trying to control everything because they're anxious, they're worried. And that type usually is thinking too much in the future. They're thinking, what if this goes wrong? Well, what if that doesn't work out? Well, what if I'm not prepared? Well, what if in 5 years my husband divorces me? Or what if in 3 years my wife doesn't like me anymore? All of those. Our brains are so creative. We can come up with anything to scare ourselves in about 3 seconds. Just thinking about anything, if we choose to. I don't recommend it. And sometimes I remind us that fear is the mind killer. When we get afraid, we stop thinking with intelligence and wisdom. So much control comes from people who are afraid. And they want to control things because they're afraid of what might happen that would go wrong, or afraid that someone is going to hurt them, or afraid that somebody else is going to get hurt. And so then they spend a lot of time thinking into the future, tomorrow, next week, next month, next year, the next 10 years. And some of that can be effective, what we call executive function, which is strategic thought. But fear-based thought is not strategic. It's based on whatever it is that's going to go wrong, whatever it is that's bad, which means that then we get into that control and judgment, negative. So yes, we want to plan for the future, but when you're around somebody who is just always asking, well, what if this goes wrong? Well, then what if that goes wrong? And what if this goes wrong? They almost sound ADD, like they can't focus. But it's a pattern or a habit of being anxious and trying to find safety and security. Well, you and I know the world doesn't conform to our plans and what we decide we want to control. And so that means when we were young, the first level of development is to learn trust. So that we trust that I'm good, people are good, the world is good, pretty good. I mean, there are mistakes made, bad things happen, traumas and tragedies happen. But if we live our lives based around those fears and then a need to control, we've lost connection with trust and peace and being patient and accepting that which is. Acceptance. So acceptance versus expectation. If we have an expectation that we're going to be in control, or we have an expectation that's unrealistic, something changes, something's out of control, what we want to do is to be able to relax into it and accept reality. So just accepting reality as it is, rather than interpreting it or trying to control it, gives so much peace of mind. And guess what? You're really nice to be around. You're a nice person to live with. So, any questions or any thoughts about the need to control, or about how you've experienced judgment? So there's a lot of judgment in old traditions. I remember my grandmother, she was quote unquote from the old country. She was first generation North American. And she'd been raised by a very stringent, hardworking, stiff, immigrant German family. So they were very serious and a lot of power and control there. So I remember her threatening my brother and sister and I don't know who it was that was misbehaving, but she would threaten, if you don't, in essence, do the right thing or the thing that I want you to do, I'm going to call the police and the police will come and get you. Now, that can terrify some kids. That's using power and control rather than having the cleverness of a parent or an adult who knows how to get kids' attention and to lead kids in a direction that's positive and constructive and playful and colorful and fun and interesting. But my grandmother, you know, she was those generations where that never happened. And I knew that her threat about calling the police and having the police come and take us away, I knew that that wasn't true, that she would never do that. But what if a child heard that and believed it? It would be so scary. It would be threatening. And to some children, depending on their environment and their growing up, it could be a trauma where it terrified them. So those old judgments, like what Granny did, that came from a long time ago, from old traditions where realistically they didn't have the time or the energy to think about being playful and creative as a parent. They were mostly looking to survive, and they did have fear about, do we have enough wood to keep the house warm through the winter, etc. So those old forms, those old-fashioned forms of judgment and criticism and blame and shaming and guilting, they're old-fashioned. They're not educated. People aren't clever and fun and creative and positive, optimistic. So we have that choice. But those traditions are everywhere present. I'll just encourage you to kind of notice, kind of just keep track. Watch where there's an expectation that's negative, where the expectation, if it's not met, then you want to avoid the person because you know you're going to get criticized or yelled at or judged, or they're going to try and control you with being, again, either reward or punishment, which is just the carrot and the stick, the bribe and the abuse. So those of us who are thoughtful, we don't want to do that. It hurts people, and it's not effective, and it hurts your relationships too. It drives a wedge. Or somebody who's already been so shamed and so guilty, it makes them even more shut down or victimized or feeling ashamed. And you know, so many of us, so I'm not an anxiety type, as you probably know. I'm a self-doubt type, which means I take guilt and I take blame. I'm smart enough now, most of the time I don't internalize it, but I used to. So if there was something wrong, I immediately felt humiliated and ashamed and accountable and scared and wanted to do whatever I could to please the person, to get approval so that I wouldn't feel attacked anymore. Those are everywhere present. And those of us who have had compromised self-esteem or compromised sense of value or worthiness, we're probably not going to be one of the people who points the finger of blame at somebody else. We'll point the finger of blame here. And when we do that, and we're not adult and pretty feeling a sense of worthiness, then we get those self-talk loops where we are mean in our own minds to ourselves. And so often those are invisible, and sometimes people don't even know that that's what they're doing to themselves all the time. It takes away our energy, it takes away our good cheer and our excitement about the things that work in life. So your self-criticism your self-blame, the guilt that you take, the disapproval that you put on yourself, pointing the finger of blame at yourself rather than thinking about, okay, what do I do to solve this problem? I am not a bad person, and I'm not an inadequate person. I'm a person. We're all just human. Those old things from some of those old traditions insisted on perfectionism, insisted on everybody looking perfect, sounding perfect, getting the perfect job, not doing something that was just human or different from the family because, my goodness, you didn't want to shame the family name by doing something that wasn't in line with the family. There's so many of those harmful things everywhere. And then, of course, the people who get angry at you when you make a mistake. And then they blame you and they tell you you're bad, or they're going to inflict punishment or abuse on you unless you correct it. So I wanted to show you my model for anger. These are these colored little clouds down here are the 6 major ways that we act out anger when we haven't used it as a tool to make something better. So this model shows the pressure cooker built around the heart. And please email me, message me, text me, and I will send this to you if you would like to have it, and certainly you have my permission to use it. So this gray area here is the pressure cooker, and inside with the heart, those are the natural, healthy feelings we all have. And when we get too stressed and triggered, all of that stuff that we've been hanging on to, usually the hard stuff, pops out in anger. And we usually have favorite forms of doing that. So on your left is people who are afraid, feel unsafe, they flee or they fight. Then the people in the middle, the people who get angry and frustrated, they hate and they scream and yell, they do fight and rage. And then the people who have low self-esteem, who feel ashamed and unworthy, they're going to take guilt and try and fix whatever it is, even if it wasn't their problem. Or they act in with shame and they try to get safe and approval. So all of those ways of of using anger are ineffective. And then at the bottom in black, you see trauma. When the difficulty has been too much for us, then that's a trauma, and we are terrified. We freeze, we dissociate, we collapse, we do whatever we can to think that it will keep us from dying. Now, of course, that's not literate, or literal, I should say. But someone who has been traumatized, sometimes their anger is extreme, out of control, sometimes violent, sometimes vicious. And if you encounter somebody who is that out of control with their anger, or if you are that out of control with your anger, please come and talk to somebody like me who understands trauma, because that will destroy your sense of trust in yourself. It will destroy a part of the trust that people have for you. So we don't want you to blame. We want you to take care of yourself, because we're going to stop trying to control others and stop judging others. And don't judge yourself wrongly or with meanness or negativity. If something isn't working, it means there's something missing. And that means come and talk to somebody like me and let's figure it out. Thank you. for keeping me company tonight. And as always, know yourself, treasure life, and love others. I'll see you next week.